We are often taught that the kings of old were God's lieutenants on earth, divine beings comprised of marble and gold, but beneath the gilded veneer of Versailles, King Louis XV was not a deity, but a man consumed by a hunger so voracious, so insatiable, that he turned the French court into a revolving door of flesh, a relentless audition where the prize was a place in his bed, and the cost was one soul. In the twilight of the 18th century, while France rotted from within, the king sought to fill the void in his spirit with an endless parade of new mistresses. Yet, among the hundreds who passed through his secret deer park, only one woman, born of the gutter and raised in sin, possessed the audacity to tame the beast. This is the haunting true story of Jeanne du Barry, the woman who ruled a king, only to pay the ultimate price to a nation thirsting for blood. Before we descend into the shadows of the past, verify your subscription to the channel and tell me in the comments, from which city are you watching this tragedy unfold tonight? To understand the monster that Versailles would become, one must first breathe in the air of the world that birthed it. In the year of our Lord 1743, the town of Vaucouleurs did not smell of powdered wigs or expensive perfume, but of damp earth, wood smoke, and the sour reek of poverty. It was here, amidst the grey and unforgiving landscape of rural France, that a child named Jeanne Bécu was brought into the world. A child whose very existence was a crime against the moral order. She was born of a scandalous union between a seamstress, whose hands were roughened by needle and thread, and a monk who had long since forgotten his vows of chastity. From her very first breath, Jeanne was branded with the invisible mark of illegitimacy, a fille de rien, a daughter of nothing, destined, by all laws of God and men, to live a life of silent servitude and die in obscurity. But destiny, it seems, has a perverse sense of humour. As the young girl grew, it became undeniably clear that she had been granted a weapon far more potent than a noble title or a heavy purse. She possessed a beauty that was not merely pleasing to the eye, but arresting, a kind of luminous vitality that seemed to suck the air out of a room. Her mother, perhaps sensing that this beauty would be either her daughter's salvation or her damnation, managed to secure her a place within the convent of Saint-Ours in Paris. One might imagine that behind the high stone walls of the convent, amidst the scent of beeswax candles and the drone of Latin prayers, Jeanne would be tamed. The nuns, with their severe habits and cold, judging eyes, sought to break the wild spirit of the girl, to mould her into a creature of silence and obedience. However, the convent became something else entirely for Jeanne. It was not a cage for her soul, but a library for her mind. While the other girls prayed for salvation, Jeanne prayed for knowledge. She devoured books with a voracious appetite, reading history, philosophy, and the classics. It was here, in the hushed solitude of the convent library, that she learned the most dangerous lesson of all, that the world was vast, that men were flawed, and that a woman with a sharp mind could navigate the currents of power just as well as any man. Yet, this intellectual rebellion couldn't last. As she blossomed into womanhood, her presence became a disruption. The sisters of Saint-Ours, sensing a sensuality in her that no amount of prayer could suppress, eventually cast her out. They expelled her back into the streets of Paris, perhaps hoping the city would swallow her whole. But Paris in the mid-18th century was not a city that swallowed beautiful women. It consumed them, yes, but it also elevated them. It was a labyrinth of shadows and light, where the gutters ran with filth and the salons sparkled with diamonds. Jeanne, now a young woman with no dowry, no name, and no protection, quickly realized that she possessed a currency that was in high demand. She began to work, initially in a millinery shop, but the meager wages of a shopgirl were insufficient for a woman who had tasted the intoxicating flavor of ambition. It was during these years that the police reports of Inspector Meusnier, who kept detailed, obsessive files on the women of Paris, began to mention her name. These primary sources, written in the dry, cynical ink of the police state, describe a woman who was beginning to understand the power of her own allure. She did not merely sell her body. That would be a crude simplification of the delicate and dangerous game she began to play. She entered the world of gallantry, becoming a woman of pleasure, a courtesan who offered companionship, wit, and beauty to the wealthy men of the capital. In this shadowy economy, sex was not an act of intimacy, but a transaction of power. Jeanne learned to listen to the complaints of old aristocrats, to laugh at the dull jokes of wealthy merchants, and to feign desire with the skill of a seasoned actress. She learned that men, regardless of their rank, were governed by their egos, and that the woman who could stroke that ego held the leash. It was in this underworld of luxury and vice that she crossed paths with the man who would alter the trajectory of her life forever, Count Jean-Baptiste du Barry. History has not been kind to the Count, and for good reason. He was a dissolute nobleman, a man known in the taverns and brothels of Paris simply as le roué, the rake. He was a predator in a silk coat, a man who viewed women not as human beings, but as investments. When du Barry first laid eyes on Jeanne, he did not see a lover. He saw a gold mine. He saw a woman whose beauty was so transcendent that it could open doors that were firmly locked to a man of his scandalous reputation. Du Barry installed Jeanne in his household, but let us be under no illusions about the nature of this arrangement. It was not a romance. It was a business partnership. Cold and calculating, he became her pimp, her manager, and her architect. He began to parade her through the salons of Paris, offering her company to the highest echelons of the aristocracy. He dressed her in the finest silks, draped her in jewels he could barely afford, and coached her in the art of conversation. Under his tutelage, the daughter of nothing learned to walk with the grace of a duchess, to eat with the refinement of a queen, and to speak with the wit of a philosopher. The strategy was simple, yet audacious. Du Barry used Jeanne to seduce powerful men, ministers, generals, courtiers, and through her, he gained influence, favors, and money. It was a symbiotic parasitism. Jeanne climbed the social ladder on her back, and du Barry climbed it on her coattails. The sensory details of this period of her life must have been overwhelming. The clinking of gold coins, the scratch of stubble against delicate skin, the heavy, suffocating scent of musk and sweat in the bedrooms of strangers. She was auditioning every night, not for love, but for survival, refining her craft, sharpening her instincts, unaware that her ambitious manager had set his sights on the ultimate prize. For Jean-Baptiste du Barry, the localized fame of Paris was not enough. He looked towards Versailles, the gilded cage where the sun never set. He knew that the king, Louis XV, was aging. The monarch was bored, melancholic, and notoriously insatiable. The king's appetite for women was the worst-kept secret in Europe. A hunger that required a constant supply of fresh meat to be satisfied. Du Barry looked at Jeanne, at her porcelain skin, her azure eyes, and her golden hair, and he concocted a plan that bordered on treasonous. He would not just sell her to a duke or a marshal, he would sell her to the King of France himself. But to do that, he first had to erase her past, scrub away the stain of the gutter, and present her as a morsel worthy of a royal palate. And so, the transformation began. The girl from Vaucouleurs was dead. The future favourite of the king was being born, carved out of ambition and painted with the colours of deception. To comprehend the sheer scale of the gamble that Count du Barry was about to undertake, we must turn our gaze toward the target of his ambition, King Louis XV, by the late 1760s. The monarch was no longer the vibrant Louis the Beloved who had once captured the hearts of his people. He was a man eroding under the weight of his own crown, a figure haunted by a profound and paralyzing boredom that the French called ennui. But this was not merely boredom. It was a spiritual sickness, a terror of death and emptiness that he sought to drown in a ceaseless tide of carnal distraction to satisfy this insatiable hunger. The machinery of the state had constructed a shadowy institution known as the Parc aux Cerfs, or the Deer Park. Historical accounts from the Vallée de Chambre, Lebel, paint a chilling portrait of this establishment. Hidden away in a discreet corner of the town of Versailles, it was essentially a private harem, a reservoir of young women maintained solely for the king's pleasure. But unlike the romanticized harems of the East, the Deer Park operated with the cold efficiency of a slaughterhouse. Young girls, often procured from the lower classes with promises of dowries or support for their families, were kept there in seclusion, educated in the arts of obedience, and prepared for the singular moment when the king might deign to visit. It was a place of muffled whispers and stolen innocence, a private zoo where the livestock was human and the keeper was the most powerful man in Europe. For a woman like Jeanne, a seasoned veteran of the Parisian salons, the Deer Park would have been a step backward. She was not a naive child to be hidden away. She was a force of nature, and so, the introduction had to be handled with extreme delicacy. The king's inner circle, particularly the aging and weary Lebel, were sceptical. They had seen hundreds of women pass through the king's bedchambers, leaving no more trace than a ripple in a pond. What made this Madame Angélique, the false name du Barry had given her, any different? But the desperation of the king was the key. He was mourning the death of his previous favourite, Madame de Pompadour, and the gloom that hung over Versailles was thick enough to choke on. He needed a distraction, and he needed it violently. The night Jeanne was brought to Versailles was not a fairy tale of glass slippers and pumpkins. It was a clandestine operation. She was smuggled up the back staircases, through the labyrinth of secret corridors that honeycombed the palace walls, passageways that smelled of damp stone and the extinguishing smoke of torches. But before she could be presented to the monarch, there was a final, humiliating hurdle that every potential mistress had to clear. In the eyes of the court, the king's body was a national treasure, a sacred vessel that could not be tainted by the diseases of the common rabble. And Jeanne, coming from the world of professional pleasure, was viewed as a biological hazard. Imagine the scene. Stripped of its cinematic romance, Jeanne was ushered into a cold, sterile chamber where the royal surgeons waited. This was not a medical checkup for her well-being. It was an inspection of merchandise. One can almost feel the biting chill of the air on her skin as she was ordered to disrobe, standing stark naked under the critical, unblinking gaze of men who viewed her not as a woman, but as a potential carrier of contagion. The sensory rule here is one of clinical violation. The touch of the doctors would have been impersonal, their hands perhaps smelling of the vinegar they used to ward off infection, their instruments clicking softly on the trays. They examined her teeth, her skin, and her most intimate areas with the detached thoroughness of horse traders checking a mare before an auction. It is a testament to Jeanne's iron will that she endured this degradation without crumbling. She stood there, a statue of ivory and gold, allowing them to verify her wholesomeness when the verdict was finally delivered, that she was saine et sauve, safe and sound. She was allowed to dress, but the inspection had shifted the dynamic. She had been stripped bare, both literally and metaphorically, and yet she remained unbroken. She understood now that in this palace, intimacy was a lie. Everything was a procedure, a protocol, a performance. Finally, the moment arrived. She was led into the king's private cabinet. Louis XV, weary and cynical, expected the usual, a shy, trembling girl who would lower her eyes, speak only when spoken to, and perform her duties with mechanical submission. He expected fear, for everyone feared the king. But when Jeanne entered the room, she brought the atmosphere of Paris with her, a scent of danger and life that the stale air of Versailles had not known for decades. She did not tremble, she did not shrink. Accounts suggest that she looked the king directly in the eyes, a breach of etiquette so flagrant it was almost treasonous. But instead of anger, Louis felt a spark. She spoke to him not as a subject to a sovereign, but as a woman to a man. She laughed, and her laughter was not the polite, tittering sound of the court ladies, but a rich, throaty sound that echoed off the gilded walls. And when the time came for the physical act, Jeanne did not lie back and think of France. She unleashed the full arsenal of skills she had honed in the luxury brothels of the capital. She introduced the aging king to pleasures he had never known, techniques that were whispered about in the libertine pamphlets, but never practiced in the royal bed. The next morning, the court expected Jeanne to be gone, dismissed with a pouch of gold like so many others before her. The courtiers, the ministers, and the king's own daughters waited for the inevitable news of her departure, but the news never came. Instead, the king emerged from his chambers with a spring in his step that had been missing for years. He was infatuated. He was obsessed. He famously declared to the Duke of Richelieu, "She makes me forget that I will soon be 60, to which Richelieu, with a cynical smirk, replied, "That is because she treats you not as a king, but as a man." However, for Jeanne to stay, for her to be more than just a passing shadow in the deer park, a massive lie had to be constructed. The rules of Versailles were rigid. Only a lady of title could be presented at court. A commoner, a fille de rien, could never officially stand beside the king. And so, the sandwich strategy of deception was deployed to legitimize her presence. The king and Count du Barry orchestrated a sham marriage. Jeanne could not marry the count himself. As he was already married to a woman he had conveniently abandoned in the countryside. So, they dragged the count's brother, Guillaume du Barry, out of obscurity. Guillaume was a simple man, happy to retire to the country with a fat pension in exchange for his signature. The wedding was a farce, a hollow ceremony performed in the dead of night. Jeanne Bécu became the Countess du Barry on paper, acquiring a noble title that was as fake as the wigs on the courtiers' heads. But to the king, the paper was enough. It was the legal fig leaf required to cover the nakedness of his desire. With the title secured, the private zoo was left behind. Jeanne was no longer a secret to be kept in the dark. She was about to be thrust into the blinding, unforgiving spotlight of the court of Versailles, a place where a smile could hide a dagger, and a compliment could be a death sentence. If the deer park was a hidden cage, then the Palace of Versailles was an open sewer masked by gold leaf. We are often seduced by the paintings of the era, the soaring ceilings of the Hall of Mirrors, the manicured gardens, the silk gowns that rustled like whispers in the corridors. But the camera of history, if we could but turn it on, would reveal a sensory reality that was far more grotesque. By the 1770s, Versailles was crumbling. It was a city of thousands packed into a single building that possessed no modern plumbing. The sensory rule here demands that we do not look, but smell. The air in the galleries, so often depicted as fragrant and airy, was in truth heavy with the stench of unwashed bodies, rotting food scraps discarded in corners, and the pervasive, acrid reek of human waste that accumulated in the hallways because the few latrines were overflowing. To survive this olfactory assault, the courtiers bathed themselves not in water, but in heavy, cloying perfumes, musk, ambergris, and civet, creating a perfumed pit where the aroma of flowers fought a losing battle against the scent of decay. It was into this suffocating atmosphere that the new Countess de Barry made her official entrance. She had the title, she had the king, and she had the diamonds, but she lacked the one thing that money could not buy: acceptance. The court of Versailles was an ecosystem of predators, and they smelled blood. To the ancient nobility, Jeanne was a walking blasphemy. They looked at her and saw the streets of Paris. They saw the illegitimate child, the shop girl, the woman who had sold herself by the hour. The king's daughters, known collectively as mesdames, were the generals of this resistance, bitter, pious, and fiercely protective of their father's dignity. They viewed Jeanne as a demon sent to tempt the king into hell. They christened her with cruel nicknames, refused to acknowledge her presence, and turned their backs, literally, whenever she entered a room. But Jeanne, tempered by the brutality of the real world, might have weathered the scorn of a few aging spinsters. Her true nemesis, the storm that would threaten to capsize her boat, arrived in a carriage from Austria. In 1770, the teenage Archduchess Marie Antoinette arrived at Versailles to marry the king's grandson, the future Louis XVI, young, sheltered, and indoctrinated with the rigid Catholic morality of the Viennese court. Marie Antoinette was everything Jeanne was not: born of royal blood, fiercely proud, and dangerously naive. The mesdames saw in this young Austrian girl a perfect weapon. They poisoned her mind before she even unpacked her trunks. They whispered the sordid details of Jeanne's past into her ear, painting the favourite not just as a mistress, but as a common prostitute who had usurped the throne of the queen. For a girl raised to believe in the divine right of kings and the sanctity of marriage, Jeanne's very existence was an insult. And so, Marie Antoinette declared a silent war in the intricate, lethal etiquette of Versailles. The most powerful weapon was the voice. The rules dictated that a person of lower rank could not speak to a person of higher rank unless spoken to first. As the Dauphine of France, Marie Antoinette outranked Jeanne. All she had to do to destroy the favourite socially was to say nothing, to look through her as if she were made of glass, and that is exactly what she did. For months, the court watched with bated breath as a humiliating ritual played out night after night. Jeanne would curtsy, smiling that radiant, confident smile, and Marie Antoinette would turn her head, staring coldly at a wall, a tapestry, or a dog. Anything but the creature standing before her. This was not merely a high school drama played out in corsets. It was a diplomatic crisis. The king was furious. He felt the snub personally. Jeanne was his chosen companion, and by disrespecting her, the Austrian girl was disrespecting the crown itself. The Austrian ambassador, Mercy Argenteau, was in a panic. He wrote frantic letters to Marie Antoinette's mother, the Empress Maria Theresa, pleading for intervention. The alliance between France and Austria, held together by this marriage, was trembling because a teenage girl refused to say hello to the king's mistress, Jeanne. For her part, found herself trapped in a gilded isolation. She was the maîtresse en titre, the most powerful woman in France. Yet she walked through crowded rooms like a ghost. She threw lavish parties, patronized the arts, and commissioned paintings that depicted her as a goddess of love. But the silence of the Dauphine hung over her like a guillotine blade. She complained to the king, but even Louis, with all his absolute power, could not force a word from his granddaughter-in-law's throat. He could exile nobles, he could declare war, but he could not command a conversation. The tension reached its breaking point on New Year's Day, 1772. The pressure from Austria was immense. The Empress Maria Theresa had sent a blistering letter to her daughter, commanding her to swallow her pride and speak to the favourite. The court was packed. Thousands of eyes were fixed on the two women. The air was thick with the heat of bodies and the electricity of anticipation. Marie Antoinette, pale and trembling, walked down the line of courtiers. She stopped in front of Jeanne du Barry. The silence stretched, agonizing and heavy, a physical weight in the room. Then the Dauphine spoke. She did not offer a compliment. She did not ask a question. She merely uttered a banal observation, a sentence that history has preserved as a monument to the absurdity of court life. Il y a bien du monde aujourd'hui à Versailles. There are many people at Versailles today. That was it. 7 words. But in the twisted logic of the palace, it was a surrender. It was an acknowledgement of existence. Jeanne had won. She curtsied deeply. Her victory secured. The king was appeased. The alliance was saved. And the court breathed a collective sigh of relief. But the victory was Pyrrhic. Marie Antoinette never spoke to her again. And in that brief, forced interaction, a seed of hatred was planted in the heart of the future queen. A hatred that would fester for years, waiting for the moment to bloom into vengeance for a brief, shining moment. However, Jeanne stood at the zenith. She had defeated the judgment of the church, the scorn of the princesses, and the silence of the Dauphine. She lived in a swirl of luxury that is difficult for the modern mind to comprehend. She ordered dresses that cost more than a peasant village earned in a century. She had a diamond necklace commissioned, a piece of jewellery so expensive and complex that it would later spark a scandal that helped bring down the monarchy. Even though she never actually owned it, she was the sun around which the aging king orbited. She soothed his fears, entertained his mind, and kept the darkness of his depression at bay. But the sensory rule reminds us that rot works from the inside out. While Jeanne played the queen in her private apartments, the foundations of the monarchy were cracking. The people of Paris, starving and overtaxed, were beginning to print pamphlets, libelles, that depicted Jeanne not as a beauty, but as a whore of Babylon, a vampire sucking the lifeblood of France to pay for her jewels. She became the scapegoat for a nation's misery. They couldn't hate the king, for he was God's anointed, so they poured all their venom onto the woman in his bed. And then, the one thing Jeanne could not charm, seduce, or negotiate with, arrived at the gates of the palace. Death. It started innocuously enough. In April 1774, the king fell ill. At first, the doctors dismissed it as a passing fever, but then the red spots appeared. Smallpox, the scourge of the century. The rot and the blade were coming for them both. The atmosphere in the palace shifted overnight from a playground of pleasure to a waiting room for the morgue. The stench of perfume was replaced by the smell of sickness. A sweet, putrid odour of decaying flesh that no amount of incense could mask. Jeanne stayed by his side, disregarding the risk of infection, disregarding the doctors who whispered that she should leave. But she knew, as she wiped the fevered brow of the man who had raised her from the gutter, that the clock had run out. The king was dying, and her protection was dying with him. The death of a king is rarely a quiet affair, but the death of Louis XV was a spectacle of horror that tested the stomachs of even the most hardened courtiers. The smallpox virus, having lain dormant, erupted with a ferocity that seemed almost biblical. The monarch's body, once the object of so much desire and reverence, began to disintegrate while he was still breathing. The sensory rule here forces us to confront the smell, a putrid, overwhelming stench of necrosis that filled the royal apartments. It was so potent that the courtiers, and even the king's own daughters, had to press vinegar-soaked handkerchiefs to their faces just to enter the room. The candles flickered in the heavy, stagnant air, casting long, dancing shadows that looked like waiting wraiths. For Jeanne, this was the end of the world. The rules of the Ancien Regime were clear. A king could not receive the last rites of the church, could not be absolved of his sins and enter heaven. While living in open adultery, the church demanded a sacrifice. The sinner had to be purged. And so, on May 4th, 1774, Louis XV, his face a mask of purple lesions, summoned the strength to give his final order regarding the woman he had loved for 6 years. He did not ask for her hand. He didn't ask for a final kiss. He told her to leave. "I have unfinished business with God," he whispered, his voice a rasping ruin. Jeanne was bundled into a carriage in the middle of the night, exiled to the Abbey of Pont-aux-Dames. As her carriage rattled over the cobblestones, leaving the Palace of Versailles behind forever, she did not look back. Behind her, the king died, his body so corrupted by disease that he was buried in a lead-lined coffin filled with spirits of wine to contain the smell, and interred in a rush, without pomp, amidst the jeers of the Parisian mob. The era of the well-beloved had ended in rot. For the next 15 years, history seemed to forget Jeanne du Barry. She was allowed eventually to leave the abbey and retire to her estate at Versailles. There, she lived a life of surprising quietude. The voracious seductress described in the pamphlets became a benevolent lady of the manor. She gave to the poor. She cared for the sick. And she maintained a salon where the conversation was gentle and the wine was sweet. It seemed as though she would be allowed to grow old in peace, a relic of a bygone age, fading slowly into the twilight. But history is a hunter that rarely loses the scent. In 1789, the world turned upside down. The French Revolution erupted, not with a whisper, but with the roar of a cannon. The Bastille fell. The feudal privileges were burned. The king and queen, Jeanne's old nemesis, Marie Antoinette, were dragged from Versailles to Paris, and then to the scaffold. The terror had begun. Jeanne, in her naivety, did not understand that the rules had changed. She was not a politician. She had never conspired against the people. In her mind, she was just a woman who had been loved by a king. But to the Jacobins, to the men like Robespierre who now held the reins of death, she was a symbol. She was the whore of the monarchy, the living embodiment of the excess, the waste, and the moral corruption that had starved the people of France. Her wealth was an insult. Her survival was a crime. The betrayal, when it came, was intimate and devastating. It did not come from a stranger, but from within her own home. Zamor, the young Bengali page boy whom the king had given her as a gift years ago, the boy she had raised, educated, and treated like a son, turned on her. Caught up in the revolutionary fervour, Zamor joined the Jacobin Club and denounced his mistress to the tribunal. He testified against her, twisting her acts of charity into evidence of counter-revolutionary plotting. It was the ultimate irony. The daughter of nothing was destroyed by a child she had saved from nothing. In 1793, Jeanne was arrested and thrown into the conciergerie, the antechamber of death. The prison was a dark, damp hellhole where aristocrats maintained a bizarre facade of etiquette while waiting to die. Duchesses curtsied to princes in the gloom, pretending they were still at court. But Jeanne could not pretend. She was terrified. She didn't possess the stoic, icy arrogance of the nobility who marched to the guillotine with their heads held high. Viewing death as just another boring ceremony, Jeanne loved life. She loved the sun, the food, the warmth of a fire, the beat of her own heart. The thought of non-existence paralyzed her with a primal fear. Her trial was a sham, a piece of theatre where the verdict was written before the judge even took his seat. She was condemned to death by the Revolutionary Tribunal. On December 8th, 1793, the executioner, Charles-Henri Sanson, a man who had known her in her days of glory, came to collect her. What followed is one of the most harrowing scenes in the history of the Revolution. Usually, the cart ride to the Place de la Révolution was a silent affair. The victims sat stiffly, refusing to give the mob the satisfaction of seeing their fear. But Jeanne broke the script as the cart trundled through the jeering crowds. She did not sit still. She wept. She screamed. She implored the crowd, shouting to the men and women she recognized, "My friends, save me! I have never hurt anyone. Why do you do this?" Her raw, naked humanity stunned the mob. For a moment, the jeers died down. They were used to seeing stone statues die. They were not used to seeing a human being, vibrant and terrified, begging for her life. It was too real. It stripped away the political abstraction and left only a frightened woman facing a machine of death. When they dragged her up the steps of the scaffold, the wooden planks slippery with the blood of those who had gone before her, she fought. She struggled against the straps, and then, as Sanson tried to position her neck beneath the lunette, she screamed the words that have echoed through the centuries. A plea so desperate it chills the blood. Encore un moment, monsieur le bourreau. Juste encore un moment. One more moment. Mr. Executioner. Just one more moment. She truly believed that if she could just have one more second, one more breath, the world might come to its senses. She thought she could bargain with time itself. But the machine did not bargain. The blade, heavy and cold, released with a mechanical thud. The scream was cut short. The daughter of nothing returned to nothing. We are often told that history is written by the victors. But sometimes, it is felt most deeply through the silence of the vanquished. Jeanne du Barry was not a saint, nor was she the demon the revolutionaries painted on their pamphlets. She was simply a woman who dared to survive in a world built to crush her. She climbed from the gutter to the throne, using the only currency society allowed her to have, only to find that the higher you climb, the colder the air becomes, and the harder the fall. Her final cry on the scaffold, that desperate plea for one more moment, strips away the glamour of Versailles and leaves us with something uncomfortable and raw. It reminds us that behind the powdered wigs, the diamond necklaces, and the grand titles, there is only the fragile, desperate human desire to keep breathing for just 1 second longer. In the end, Jeanne did not die like a queen, with stoic detachment. She died like us. And perhaps that is why her ghost still lingers, not in the gilded halls of the palace, but in the sharp, sudden silence that follows the fall of the blade.